Hello, my name is Stephen Wicks. I'm curator here at the Knoxville Museum of Art, and I'm hoping to treat you to a virtual tour of the KMA exhibition Buford Delaney and James Baldwin Through the Unusual Door. It's a very important exhibition for this community, for this museum, because it pays tribute to Knoxville's most important artist, Buford Delaney. And the exhibition had only been open for about 5 weeks before we had to close down because of the coronavirus pandemic. And so this is our way of being able to share it with you despite those circumstances. Buford Delaney was a remarkable individual. He's one of the 20th century's great modern painters. And what's exciting is that so much of his story, his remarkable journey as an artist, was witnessed by one of America's great civil rights activists and writers of the 20th century, James Baldwin. And so this exhibition seeks to tell the story of these two men's remarkable 38-year friendship and the different points of intersection during that time, the ways in which they influenced one another. And in so many cases, the most vivid accounts of Delaney's artistic evolution come by way of Baldwin, who was Delaney's protege. And so that's what this exhibition is trying to tell. And even though there's nothing like seeing Buford Delaney's paintings in the flesh, my hope is that this virtual tour will become the next best thing, and that once the pandemic dies down, many of you will be able to come here and enjoy this exhibition firsthand. In fact, we're going to be extending it into October 25th. So we're hoping that many of you who are watching this virtual tour can actually plan to come and visit and see the exhibition yourselves. We've laid out the exhibition in several thematic groupings that follow a more or less chronological path. The section devoted to portraits pays tribute to Delaney's talent as a highly imaginative and inventive portrait painter. Featured among the broad selection of portraits in this exhibition are several of those of Baldwin and a number of Delaney's own self-portraits, which together represent the fascinating variety of ways in which Delaney expressed his own identity and that of Baldwin, who considered Delaney his mentor. After growing up in Knoxville, Buford Delaney goes off to Boston by 1923, and he's there for several years studying art, visiting museums. He then arrives in New York City by 1929 and creates his first really stable chapter of his career there, and sets up a studio at 181 Green Street in Greenwich Village. And it's there that a teenage James Baldwin makes a journey up a flight of stairs, knocks on this door at 181 Green Street because a friend had told him there was this artist that he needed to meet who had a studio there. So the door opens, and Baldwin recounts years later how he sees this man standing in the doorway, Buford Delaney, and how Buford Delaney had these intense eyes and scans him up and down. And he walks through Delaney's doorway into the studio and sees amazing colors on the wall. He hears Delaney's music coming from a phonograph, and his world is transformed by Delaney. And that becomes the beginning of this amazing friendship. And this is, in fact, the first portrait, first of many portraits of Baldwin by Buford Delaney. And it's from 1941. It's called Dark Rapture. And here we see Delaney depicting Baldwin not in a way that resembles most photographic likenesses of Baldwin. Instead, it seems more like an idyllic, shadowy figure study, where he's not maybe quite sure yet of who this young man is and what he'll become. And so it's a painting that to me is full of mystery and potential. I'm fascinated by the color scheme, the way that Delaney applies all these different colors to give this lively effect. And color and light were two objectives that Delaney brought to every painting that he sought to create. And they're certainly alive and well in this first ever portrait by Delaney of James Baldwin. This is the next portrait by Delaney of his friend James Baldwin. It's done in 1944 when Baldwin was about 20 years old. And you can see that it's very different than Dark Rapture. By this point, Delaney and Baldwin have really gotten to know one another. And here, Delaney depicts Baldwin as this forceful individual, this haloed, grand head with a face with those prominent eyes that Baldwin was noted for. And here, Baldwin looks back at us with this great confidence and maturity that I guess Delaney had recognized in his young friend by this time. He was already beginning to realize his gifts and had this forceful voice of reason and reality when it came to civil rights. But this pastel is also noteworthy because of the color scheme, that same kind of adventurous, experimental approach to color that we see when we look at the facial features and almost an iridescent array of color inside Baldwin's face. It's interesting how this unusual color scheme aligns with another one of Baldwin's famous recollections from this early period with Delaney. It's an episode in which Baldwin describes how Delaney forever transformed the way that he viewed the world, and how Delaney did so in the most ordinary way. The two men were walking through the rainy streets of Greenwich Village, and Delaney stops and tells Baldwin, "Look." All Baldwin sees in the street is an oily puddle. Delaney says, "Look again." And suddenly Baldwin notices how the puddle becomes this swirling iridescence caused by the mixture of oil and water. And it results in a reflection of the city that's radiant and otherworldly. Baldwin said that he never saw the world the same way again. The pastel bears an inscription in the lower right to John Arvonio from Buford Delaney, 1944. It turns out that John Arvonio was an experimental filmmaker who knew both Delaney and Baldwin. And from appearances, this pastel was probably a gift to Arvonio from Delaney. Arvonio is best known for his 1952 short film, Abstract in Concrete, that focuses on vivid reflections in the rainy streets of New York City. Perhaps this indicates Arvonio was aware of the street puddle story and used it as inspiration for his film. Perhaps it also suggests Delaney derived his iridescent color scheme in the pastel portrait from his memories of the puddle. The puddle, it turns out, is but one of several examples in which Delaney finds artistic inspiration in reflective surfaces in his immediate environment. And his famous account of this puddle story makes this interesting connection between film, this Delaney pastel, and its color scheme, and Baldwin's words of this early encounter with Delaney's powers of observation. Just like artists such as Picasso and Rembrandt, Delaunay, in addition to creating portraits of others, often depicted himself. And here is one of his more famous self-portraits. It's entitled Auto Portrait from 1965. It's in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And here we see a shadowy likeness of Delaunay. It's bold, it's thickly painted, and behind him it almost makes you think that perhaps he's standing in front of one of his Clamart abstractions. It's fiery and brilliant and glowing. And we see this upturned collar, the cigarette hanging from the side of his mouth. He often depicted himself with the cigarette. He was close to a chain smoker. And what is exciting is, as well known as this portrait is, we came across in a Knoxville collection what I believe to be a preliminary study for this well-known Delaunay painting. This is the watercolor self-portrait that Buford Delaunay created in 1964, not long before his famous auto portrait that we just saw. And here we see the same basic composition, the same upturned collar. The only difference is it's basically a mirror image of the Whitney painting, except he's kept the cigarette in the same corner of his mouth. And so I believe this to be, again, a preparatory study for this well-known Whitney Museum self-portrait. One of the first sections in this exhibition focuses on Buford Delaunay's paintings of New York. He lived in New York from 1929 to 1953, and he became known during this period not only for his vivid portraits, but of his street scenes of the Greenwich Village neighborhood where he lived. And so I'm going to be introducing you to a selection of paintings from this section, such as this painting entitled Green Street from 1946. In fact, Green Street is the street on which Delaunay's studio for many years existed, at 181 Green Street, and it's at that studio where Delaunay and Baldwin met. Baldwin was a teenager, and he had been told about Delaunay, went up the stairs to Delaunay's studio, knocks on the door, and then has that amazing experience of walking into Delaunay's world. But they often would walk the streets of Greenwich Village together, and Delaunay had this amazing ability to capture these ordinary urban environments, but he would transform them in ways that were expressive and highly individual. He had extensive academic training and skill, but like his heroes Picasso and Matisse, he chose to set those academic devices such as spatial perspective and naturalistic color, he chose to set those aside in search of what he perceived as deeper expressive meaning, something that he explored intuitively. And he always believed that beneath the surface layer of visible reality was this world of light and color. And it's that world that he sensed around him, and it's that world that he sought to reveal through his paintings, such as Green Street, where we see jewel-like colors. We see swirling thick paint applied almost like a relief sculpture. There's so much going on in the surface. And then instead of describing a particular avenue or place that you could actually walk through with your eyes, he distills down this imagery into bold, powerful shapes that attracted his eye. Usually it's lampposts and manhole covers, other things that just for some reason had a geometry that appealed to him. And in this way, he takes these ordinary surroundings, often drab surroundings of Greenwich Village, and elevates them into this world of otherworldly light and color. This untitled painting from 1947 might be a surprise to some who view this exhibition. They might wonder, why is it included in a section about New York City and urban scenes? Well, in fact, this remarkable painting, I think, is compelling evidence of Delaney's interest in abstraction long before he arrives in Paris in 1953. And these adventures into abstraction were, I think, often prompted by his interest in looking at reflective surfaces around him for compositional ideas, windows, stained glass, puddles. And my belief is that this composition, in fact, recalls Delaney's episode where he's walking the streets of Greenwich Village with James Baldwin and calls to Baldwin's attention this street puddle with swirling iridescent colors. And so here we see what may be Delaney's recollections of the puddle through the veil of several years of memory. We see those swirling colors. We see any hard-edged urban forms dissolved by this thick paint. And then there are these floating bits of imagery. There's a white bird, a couple of stars. Perhaps these are reflections of what he saw overhead, looking down at the puddle. We see what appears to be some sort of a distorted heart shape. And then at the center of the composition is this abstracted eye. Perhaps this is Delaney's reference to his own view of this puddle. And so if we take Baldwin's words, Baldwin's recollections of this puddle experience with Delaney, and compare it to this composition, I think a case could be made for this being, in fact, Delaney's way of capturing in paint the puddle itself. This untitled painting, as with the pastel portrait of Baldwin, raises a fascinating question. Did Baldwin's story spark Arvonio's film? And to what extent, if at all, was Arvonio aware of and inspired by Delaney's puddle-inspired compositions? The similarity in imagery would seem to suggest these influences did play a role in Arvonio's film. you.